Good afternoon and happy Wednesday. I'm sorry to be a Nuggets stan today, but I just have to be. So if you hate the Nuggets or you hate basketball, just humor me. I promise this will be the last time I start a lecture with quotes about basketball or referring to some player, I swear. So to begin today's lecture, I just want to share an excerpt from an article written by Jackie McMullen, who's a basketball analyst for ESPN. And she actually wrote this article last year during the playoffs about Jamal Murray. And as I was thinking about the 10,000 hour rule and our focus for today's lecture and the next chapter in the book, I couldn't help but think about this article. That was a great piece on Jamal Murray, which gives some background on his upbringing and how his father trained him as a youngster. So here's an excerpt from that article. When Jamal Murray was a baby, his father steered his stroller to the sidelines so he could absorb the sights and sounds of the game as Roger played pickup, Roger's his dad, on the public courts of Kitchener, Ontario. As Jamal grew older, Roger would set up a portable plastic Fisher Price hoop so he could drain his own game winners during his father's games. By the time Jamal was 7, he was required to drain 30 consecutive free throws before he could stop for the day. Roger limited distractions, disconnecting the television and forbidding cell phones, video games, and frivolous trips to the mall. Roger fell in love with the game by watching clips of Michael Jordan and incorporated the teachings of Bruce Lee and Kung Fu into his vision for his son. He stressed physical strength, mental fortitude, and inner calm. Jamal learned to meditate daily, eliminating outside noise by focusing on his breathing and lowering his heart rate below 40 beats a minute. It became a non negotiable component of his workout, no interruptions, not even a recruiting visit in 2015 from Kentucky assistant Kenny Payne, who approached Murray one day as he finished his workout, only to be instructed by Roger to wait while Jamal sat cross legged, eyes blissfully shut, in a corner of the gym. Roger's training workouts were taxing, many of them outside in the winter months. Push ups in the snow, laps before school, conditioning routes straight uphill that were run sideways or backward. Murray took all lefty shots so he would be ambidextrous, did pull ups using the crossbar of the local soccer goal in the park. When the outdoor basketball courts were flooded to create makeshift hockey rinks, Roger instructed his son to dribble his ball on a sheet of ice. I have excellent balance, Murray says. That's a learned behavior. Can a father mold a son into an elite NBA star? What are the physical limits of a professional athlete? And what is Jamal Murray's ceiling? We put limits on ourselves as human beings, physically and mentally, to each his own, Rogers says. But why not do more? Jamal, for his part, says he welcomed his father's grueling workouts, one that Roger concedes some in their Kitchener community felt were excessive. What you need to understand is I did it with love and I did it with passion, Jamal says. It wasn't work for me. So, especially that last quote, Jamal Murray saying, what you need to understand is I did it with love and I did it with passion. It wasn't work for me. A big takeaway I wanted you to receive from Frank Bruni's New York Times article on how to get the most out of college was toward the end of the article, where he and others gave some advice as far as picking a major and trying to encourage students to pick a major that they feel passionate about and that they love. And that in turn is a great motivator as far as being able to accumulate your 10,000 hours is being immersed in something that you love, that you're passionate about, where, as Jamal Murray says, it won't feel like work for you. So I immediately think about Frank Bruni's article. And then back to the 10,000 hour rule, just the amount of time that Jamal Murray's father, Roger, put in with him since he was a baby, the extreme and grueling workouts he put his son through, even incorporating things like kung fu and Bruce Lee. And Bruce Lee was always known for his discipline as a martial artist. And to be able to incorporate all these elements into his training and his workouts with his son, to where last night I'm watching the Nuggets and Clippers game, and I'm just saying to myself that the Nuggets look like the more poised team. They look like the more poised players toward the end of the game. And specifically, Jamal Murray looked like he was ready and prepared to seize the moment. And the expectation going into that game was that it would be Kawhi Leonard and Paul George of the Clippers who would be the ones that would take that game over and capitalize on their moment in advancing their team. But that wasn't the case. It was Jamal Murray who looked like the player most ready, most poised for that moment, and most prepared to capitalize on that opportunity. And so I just want to lead in with that. Again, I'm sorry for being a Nuggets stan today, but just watching that game last night, you could just tell the preparation, the hard work, the dedication that Jamal Murray has put into mastering the craft of basketball. You could just see on full display last night how his preparation allowed him to succeed at the highest level, and to really capitalize on a great opportunity that he had, in advancing our Denver Nuggets to the Western Conference Finals. So, on to chapter 3. And chapter 3 and chapter 4 are actually connected. So you can think of chapter 3 as part 1 and chapter 4 as part 2 of this specific argument that Gladwell is going to make in these chapters, which he titles The Trouble with Geniuses. Okay, so I've been mostly praising Malcolm Gladwell on his writing and on the chapters and his arguments in this book up to this point. And I'll praise him just one more time, and then I'm going to be a bit critical of him in this lecture. So, something that Malcolm Gladwell does well as a writer, especially as far as his argumentative writing is concerned, is he's very good at anticipating counterclaims that the readers might have as they're reading his arguments. So, for example, he begins the book with opportunities, and then he anticipates a counterclaim that the reader might have to this argument that a lot of success just comes from luck and from opportunities. And so he anticipates readers having this counterclaim about, well, what about hard work? Obviously, hard work has to do with an individual's success as well. And so then he addresses it in the following chapter in talking about how, again, it's a combination of all these factors. And he goes out of his way to address other counter arguments, those being that, yes, talent, innate ability, genes are obviously very important to individual success. But again, we can't forget about the environment, the surroundings of an individual, and these outside factors that contribute just as much to individual success. So now, as a writer going into chapter 3 and chapter 4, he's anticipating this counterclaim that readers might have. That being that, okay, well, what about somebody that's just so talented and has such great ability and genes? What about those individuals? And in particular, individuals that we might consider to be geniuses. Like the counterclaim being, come on, geniuses, people with immense innate talent and ability, they're probably able to be successful maybe without dedicating 10,000 hours or without needing the extra advantages and opportunities that surroundings might bring. So Gladwell decides to address the trouble with geniuses in these particular chapters. And again, he's anticipating the potential counterclaims to his own argument and questions that readers might be bringing up internally as they're reading his book and his argument. So, to be specific, on page 76, Gladwell writes, so far in Outliers, we've seen that extraordinary achievement is less about talent than it is about opportunity. In this chapter, I want to try to dig deeper into why that's the case by looking at the outlier in its purest and most distilled form, the genius. Okay? And then he goes on to explain on chapter 79, or excuse me, on page 79, but there's a catch. The relationship between success and IQ works only up to a point. Once someone has reached an IQ of somewhere around 120, having additional IQ points doesn't seem to translate into any measurable real world advantage. So the connection there is he's connecting IQ and the way we measure IQ and intelligence to this genius level that certain individuals might possess as far as their mental capacity is concerned. And he wants to argue again that intellect, that IQ only matter up to a certain point. And once you pass that point, and he's going to refer to that point as a threshold, once an individual passes a certain point of intelligence, of intellect, and IQ, those things stop mattering. And again, what ends up mattering just as much are environment, surroundings, opportunities. And then in the case of the two individuals he's going to focus on in chapter 3 and 4, a person's upbringing, a person's background and family background in particular, which we all know is extremely important to us as individuals, is our family background, the way that we were raised, the way that our parents have brought us up. We all understand, I think, that those things are very important to us as individuals and are important as far as our own individual success is concerned. And Gladwell is going to focus in chapters 3 and 4 on two individuals who have a very high IQ and intellect. And the first person that he introduces in chapter 3 that he will focus on in this section of the book is a man named Chris Langan. And Chris Langan is known for his IQ, which is somewhere around 200. Gladwell opens the chapter by talking about him being on a game show called 1 versus 100, which is one of these game shows where you can win money by answering questions that measure your intellect. And you can find this on YouTube, actually. If you do a YouTube search, Chris Langan 1 versus 100, you can see the episode that Gladwell refers to in the beginning of the chapter. And you can see that Chris Langan does, in fact, win $250,000. You can see the questions that he answers on his way to get there. So he's going to use Chris Langan as an example of an individual who has an extremely high IQ, an extremely high intellect, and he's going to go on to explain that Chris Langan was never able to reach the level of success that we would all expect him to achieve based on his talents and abilities, that he wasn't able to get to that level of elite success because of some outside factors that were holding him back. And in particular, Gladwell is going to argue that the way he was raised, his family upbringing, had a lot to do with him not being able to really reach an elite level of success. And Chris Langan is a successful man in many ways, but the point Gladwell is making is he just didn't achieve the type of success we would expect him to achieve based on his IQ and his intellect. So he's going to focus and introduce chapter 3 with Chris Langan, and then he's going to come back to Chris Langan again in chapter 4 and compare him to another high profile famous individual who was known for having a high IQ and intellect that did reach an elite level of success. And we'll talk more about him as we get to chapter 4 and in the next video lecture. So as far as your quiz on Friday is concerned, some focus areas again will be Gladwell's focus for this chapter. I'll ask a question about that, and he explicitly excuse me, states it in the pages I already referred to in this lecture. A study that Gladwell is going to bring up in this chapter has to do with the University of Michigan. Again, University of Michigan. That was a big reference point of the previous chapter with Bill Joy. And so now we're back to the University of Michigan again. And this time Gladwell is going to focus on a study that was done about the University of Michigan. Sorry about that. He's going to refer to a study that focused on the University of Michigan and its affirmative action policies as far as um, them admitting students into graduate law school at the University of Michigan. And this is a really important part of the chapter, I feel like, so I kind of want to elaborate on it a bit right now because it might be a bit confusing to understand the point he's making with this study. But affirmative action, as you all are probably aware of, is a very controversial attempt to make things fair for everyone, and in particular, to give minorities, people from minority races, opportunities that maybe they wouldn't otherwise receive. And so, what's controversial about the idea of affirmative action is that in hiring processes, or in this case, in the acceptance of graduate students, etc., selection processes, hiring processes, is that individuals who are minorities may get an advantage in those hiring or selection processes based on the fact that they're minorities, and that might give them a leg up on their peers that are not minorities, and they might be hired or selected with that being a reason for their hiring or their selection, which again is unfair in many ways, because the idea of making hiring selection processes fair is that you hire the best qualified candidate. And that's why a lot of individuals have an issue with affirmative action, is because individuals that maybe weren't as qualified as their peers are getting an opportunity. And a reason they are getting that opportunity, part of that is the fact that they're of a minority race. So, what Gladwell is going to bring up is that the University of Michigan decided to find out how their minority students were doing after graduate law school. And the assumption is that because these individuals were less qualified than their peers, they're probably not doing as well as their peers. But what the University of Michigan found out through their study is that the minority students were doing just as well as their peers, and in fact were excelling. And so again, we're back to this idea of opportunity, and how sometimes an individual just needs an opportunity to succeed and to capitalize. And how, again, back to intelligence, ability, in this case, being accepted into a graduate program, they're going to look at your test scores and your grades and things like that. And again, the idea in this chapter is those things only matter up to a certain point, and then what matters after that point is what an individual does with the opportunity that they're given. And so I think that's a really interesting part of the chapter, and for me, probably the highlight of the chapter, just because I find that to be very interesting, that the students who received affirmative action advantages and opportunities were doing just as well as other individuals in this graduate law program that had higher credentials than they did, that probably had higher test scores and admittance exam test scores, etc., that they were doing just as well given the opportunity, and that all they needed was that opportunity to thrive and succeed. And then the other study that Gladwell will highlight in this chapter and come back to in the next chapter that follows is this study done by Lewis Terman, who was fascinated with IQ. And in particular, he was fascinated with this idea of child prodigies being out there, and finding these child prodigies, these kids who have a very high IQ, and being able to select them and single them out and put them into programs that are more advanced, that might push them to further develop their intellect and their talents and their abilities at a higher level. And we know these programs today as being gifted and talented programs that we grow up with in the education system. A lot of that comes from Lewis Terman's initial study and attempt to find and single out these highly intelligent youngsters, these kids, to put them in gifted and talented programs to push them to reach the peak of their abilities later on in life. And again, Gladwell uses this study to address the counterclaim to his own argument, but then the results of the study actually end up supporting Gladwell's claims, which is, I'll leave that for you to find out as a reader, but we get the results of Lewis Terman's study toward the end of the chapter, and we're going to find out that Terman is very disappointed with the results of his attempt to create gifted and talented programs for youngsters. As he follows up on these kids later on in life and sees what they actually achieve as individuals, he ends up being disappointed. So, focus areas for your quiz on Friday. You can expect questions related to Gladwell's focus for this chapter, um, Gladwell's argument about IQ and how much it actually matters. And again, we could think of IQ as intellect. Um, Again, you want to focus on the claims that Gladwell is making about how much IQ and intellect actually matter as far as individual success is concerned. And then again, two studies that you can expect questions about are the University of Michigan and its affirmative action policy, and the results of Lewis Terman's study of the young, gifted, and talented. So I'm going to leave it right there. Again, I hope you're enjoying the book. I really hope you enjoyed also Frank Bruni's article about how to get the most out of college, because I just feel like that's such a great read for any college student. And just you get such great advice in that article about ways that you can make the most of this opportunity you have as a college student, ways to make the most of your experience and to capitalize on opportunities that are around you. So, um, hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Good luck on Friday's quiz, and go Nuggets.